Welcome. This is the first lecture on video lecture, rather a video discussion. I don't really want it to be a lecture, hopefully not. On Mutua, I'm going to pick up the thread of argument where we left it last Wednesday, which I suppose is going to be our last in-person meeting, unfortunately, but we're in challenging times. So I'm going to pick up from Mutua's argument about the reality but also distinctiveness of human rights in the African tradition. And I want to begin by focusing on his explicit critique of Jack Donnelly, as well as Rhoda Howard, who's a Canadian human rights theorist, shares some of Donnelly's suspicions about the reality of pre-modern, non-European analogs of human rights. Then I want to move on to focus in on the dialectic or interconnection between rights and duties. Mutua sees this as essential to the uniquely African conception of human rights, but I think this dialectic or this interconnection between rights and duties is of general significance. He raises some profoundly important political and philosophical arguments, some of which I think have been brought home to us in the last week as the spread of the pandemic reminds us perhaps of the importance of duty, obligation, and centralized authority. So I'll touch on that. And then I'm going to talk only very briefly about African religions. Clearly, I'm not an expert in indigenous religions in Africa. I will leave it to Mutua to unpack the important issues there, since he has much more intimate understanding of those issues. And I'll conclude by talking about what to Mutua is the most important human right, the right to self-determination. So I'm going to read from the text and then comment, and we'll see how it goes. This is an experiment. For me, experiments can blow up, as those of you who had chemistry sets when you were kids can know. But sometimes they work out, and sometimes they work in one dimension and not in another. So we're in uncharted waters, so we'll see what happens. But I want to pick up the issue from, it's page 79, right? And here he criticizes both Howard and Donnelly. But let me talk about Donnelly. We'll recall when we were looking at Donnelly and what I've called the standard interpretation of human rights, it locates the historical origin of human rights in the natural rights of the 18th century, right? And those rights emerged to solve a particular sort of problem, right? Controlling or subordinating state power to the interests of the propertied class, right? And so the civil rights which took shape in the 18th century were designed, as I've emphasized before, to protect property and the property-owning individual from state power from above and social power from below, from the king and the peasantry. Okay? So they argue that human rights trace their origin to that point in time, right? And the rights that became identified as human rights after the passage of the crafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, they are the fully universalized version of those natural rights. Or, to put it differently, those natural rights freed from the limitation of citizenship. They are the rights that belong to human beings in virtue of their humanity, in virtue of their fundamental interests as dignified, autonomous agents. Okay. Mutua kind of turns the tables on them. You'll recall Donnelly's discussion of relative universality. He says human rights are relatively universal, right? They are universal relative to certain important human interests, which have become more and more clearly accepted over the last 50, 60, 70 years, right? So they're relatively universal. They don't exist at all times in all places. They have a particular history, but they've become more and more and more broadly accepted so that we can call them universal human rights. Mutua says, really, can we? Either they're universal, in which case other traditions, in his case African, right, can rightly claim to have analogous principles, or Donnelly and Howard are ethnocentric. Right? Either human rights are European, and therefore in the African context are a legacy of colonial imposition, or if they're universal, they have to embrace the wider traditions, right? Including, in Mutua's case, African conceptions of human rights. I just want to draw your attention to the text. It's page 79, right? Beginning with Howard, he says, in an impassioned critique of scholars she regards as African cultural relativists, Rhoda Howard notes that although relatively homogeneous, undifferentiated, simple societies of pre-colonial Africa had effective means for guaranteeing what is now known as human rights, there was nothing specifically African about them. Such a model, which she calls the communitarian ideal, represents typical agrarian pre-capitalist social relations in non-state societies. Elsewhere, Howard argues that industrialization has dismantled what she refers to as the peasant worldview or communitarian ideal and replaced it with the values of secularism, personal privacy, and individualism. Right? And then he quotes Donnelly directly from the book we read. Mutua continues a couple of sentences further down. Donnelly dismisses the notion that pre-colonial societies knew the concept of human rights, an argument he thinks moot because the communitarian ideal has been destroyed and corrupted by the, quote, teeming slums of non-Western states, the money economy, and Western values, products, and practices. So what's the upshot of this? The upshot, on page 80, he tells us, right, Donnelly and Howard face other problems as well. The first difficulty, and perhaps the most troublesome, is the implication in their works that only European liberalism, a philosophy they seem to think inevitable under modernization, can be the foundation for the concept of human rights. And then the next paragraph, the second difficulty, which is an extension of the first, is the implied duty on Westerners to impose the concept of human rights on non-European cultures and societies because it is a universal concept that all societies must accept for their own good, right? But if it's universal, then it has to embrace all sorts of other human traditions. Otherwise, the implication is that those are somehow not fully human. So he's trying to turn their arguments against them, right? And again, the whole book asks us to reverse our perspective, right? Don't treat Europe as the normative ideal for all humanity. Examine that critically from other perspectives, whether, as in his case, the African perspective, in our own case in Canada, looking at it from the perspective of indigenous nations, the relationship is analogous. When these ideas come from the outside, they either come from the outside and are colonial impositions, or they have to somehow be articulated with local and indigenous traditions and therefore embrace different conceptions of what is essential to human being. Some things don't change. I'm still having a tea while I talk, even though I'm in my house and not the education building. Okay, so what is distinctive about the African conception of human rights? Mutua goes on in some detail about it. I'm going to leave the details to you. You still have the texts. But what I want to focus on is what he calls the dialectic of rights and duties. Right? One of the concerns, and Donnelly raised these as well if you go back and look, one of the concerns about strong conceptions of duty is that from a liberal perspective, a stress on duty or an equivalent stress on duty looks like authoritarianism, looks like undue state power or coercion exercised over the individual. But this simply stems from a different conception of individuality and the relationship between individuality and the community, according to Mutua. In the African context, right, from the perspective of a society or a culture where the individual is nothing outside of their relationships and their traditions, right? Duty is not a burden right, is not an expression of state power or authoritarianism. What it is an expression of the bonds that link the individual to the community, without which there would be neither individual nor community. Mutua here constructs rights as, entitlements, taking from the community. I have a right to X. But if there's no duty to give back, then ultimately there's going to be nothing left of the community, right? So, Mutua gives a number of examples where something like individual rights, or what we would call in a European liberal tradition rights, individual rights exist. He gives a number of examples, and I'll leave you to work through those in the text, right? But if there's nothing to claim because nobody gives back, then there is neither community nor individual. So we have to have a dialectical conception of duties and rights. However this is constructed legally, at the material level, at the social level, there must be a giving back. If there's no giving back, there's nothing for anyone to claim right to. And so this is yet another example of the problematic understanding, the problematic understanding of individuality in liberal philosophy. Right? Mutua maintains that the liberal conception of individuality it completely abstracts it from its material, social, cultural embeddedness. Right? And so he gives us another version of the critique that Tipo gave us, that Virginia Hell gave us, a critique of the idea that the individual and the fundamental interest of the individual is contained in this moral atom, right, that floats around in space, unencumbered of anything, right? That's not a real person, right? Even the liberal is a culturally embedded person. And once again, when we accept Mutua's challenge to reverse our perspective, right? If we're looking at it from, if we're looking at the issue of human rights from the perspective of the liberal conception of rights, if we reverse the perspective, we can see that Europe is, of course, a culture or a network of cultures, right? And that the abstract idea of individuality is not a universal truth. Right? It's the way in which individuality developed in European society. And it's deeply problematic precisely because it fails to account for the duties that we have to each other. So the duty, the emphasis on duty in the African conception of human rights is really an emphasis on contributing back to the whole from which we appropriate what we need. So let me come back to the text in just a couple of important issues. First of all, on the conception of human being that underlies the affirmation of duty. This is page 82, right in the middle of the page. Capturing the view of many Africans, B. Obina Okere has written that the African conception of man is not that of an isolated and abstract individual, but an integral member of a group animated by a spirit of solidarity. Kiba Mbaye, the renowned African jurist, has stated that in Africa, quote, laws and duties are regarded as being two facets of the same reality, two inseparable realities. And this philosophy is summed up by John Mbiti, quote, I am because we are, and because we are, therefore I am. According to this view, individuals are not atomistic units locked in a constant struggle against society for the redemption of their rights. The Dinka concept of Sieng, for example, quote, places emphasis on such human values as dignity, integrity, honor and respect for self and others, loyalty and piety, compassion and generosity, and unity and harmony. Right? And this brings me back to the issue that I was trying to emphasize in our first two discussions of Mutua. Mutua insists on the plurality of cultures, right? He insists on the diversity of ways of being human, but I believe he still affirms certain fundamental values as universal, right? I think we can understand him as, in a sense, a humanist, but his conception of humanity is as builders of cultural worlds, and those cultural worlds differ Dignity is a universal human value, but what is dignified treatment and behavior differs given different cultural traditions. But all of us, European, Ghanaian, Kenyan, what have you, right? All of us are culture builders. And we must be respected as human beings insofar as we are culture builders. So, when you impose one set of norms as truly human, right, you're denying the humanity of those whose cultures you disparage. If there's going to be a future for human rights, as we've emphasized before, this future has to be achieved through the route of egalitarian intercultural dialogue, right? Genuine respect for different cultures as ways of being human. That's the crucial point, right? He then goes on to talk about the consequences of both Islamic and Christian proselytization in Africa, how these analogs of the colonial missions disaggregated, disrupted traditional African societies, traditional African religions, and the damage that it caused, right? Certainly those of us who have grown up in Canada are or should certainly be aware now of the similar implications of the residential school system on Indigenous nations here. So there's no mystery about the consequences for cultures and individuals when their traditional beliefs are disrupted and attacked and demonized and destroyed. I won't go into any of the details that Mutua discusses in relation to African religions. I'm not an expert, and I really don't have anything to add that he doesn't put quite eloquently and straightforwardly in the book. I want to end this discussion by looking at really the central political value of Mutua's conception of human rights, and that's the principle of self-determination. So again, let me come back to the text, skipping ahead a little bit. It's page 108. Arguably the most important positive political argument that Mutua makes. And it connects up in interesting ways, I think, with Teeple's critique. So I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. So page 108, this is the second full paragraph. It is my argument that the most fundamental of all human rights is that of self-determination, and that no other right overrides it. Without that of self-determination, without this fundamental group or individual right, no other human right could be secured, since the group would be unable to determine for its individual members under what political, social, cultural, economic, and legal order they would live. Any right which directly conflicts with this right ought to be void to the extent of that conflict, right? So what's he saying here? Donnelly, too, recall, affirmed the right of self-determination to peoples living under colonial rule. But he seemed to think, now if we look back, that the process of self-determination would lead in a liberal democratic direction, right? Would lead to something like the conditions of modern life under a liberal democratic or social democratic welfare state. Right? Mutua challenges that conception, right? And he challenges it on the basis of the very logic of the value of self-determination. A group of people that determine their collective life cannot be expected by default to determine it, express it, or realize it in any one particular way. Why would an African nation emerging from colonialism, in determining its own future, automatically or necessarily reinvent itself along European liberal lines? That's not self-determination. That's assimilation to a foreign ideal from Mutua's perspective. Self-determination means determination of the collective life of the nation or the culture in accordance with its own traditions. Right? Now, one could ask Mutua, but what if the expressed will is to articulate the nation with European liberal traditions, right? Is that not self-determination? Must self-determination mean the affirmation of traditional cultures? That's a difficult question, and I won't answer for him. Instead, I want to close by just thinking through the logic of his use of it, right? He's certainly on solid ground to maintain that, at least considered politically, the right to self-determination has to be the most fundamental right, because if you don't have the right to self-determination, the only other alternative is somebody else is determining you. And how can people be free, autonomous individuals if their political, economic, etc. life is controlled by a foreign power, right? Again, when we reverse perspective, we see clearly Mutua's argument, right? When we look at the situation of the history of Canada from an Indigenous perspective, whether we're Indigenous or not, we can see the point of Mutua's argument, right? Individual members of those cultures cannot be self-determining if they're not in control of their collective life, because it's the collective life that our individual existence depends upon. So I suppose that Mutua commits himself to allowing indigenous cultures, traditional African cultures, to determine their future as they see fit. But this precludes their being changed by NGOs, Western powers, Western corporations, right? That's what he's trying to flag. Colonialism has not stopped with the end of white rule in Africa, right? Colonialism continues by other means, and one of those means is the standard interpretation of human rights to the extent that it conflicts with the right of African nations to determine their own future. Right? There's much more that could be said, as there always is, but I don't want these video lectures or whatever you want to call them to go on for an hour and 20 minutes. That would be unbearable for you, I'm sure. You can always email the discussion function on both Blackboard sites is active, I do believe, so you can converse amongst yourselves there. Email me. Get in touch, and I will wrap it up. This one, I've posted all the Mutua notes. I will, just create these videos when the muse strikes. Probably by the end of next week, all my notes and all the videos will be up. If you have questions about the assignment, please get in touch and try and keep working as best you can. And I'm sure it's a very stressful time for you as well, probably more so for you than for me, although it's a little stressful as well for me. But we will get through it, and I hope to see you in person at some point again.